Another common question parents ask when they begin exploring private school admissions is this: should my child take the ISEE or the SSAT? And for many families, the question feels surprisingly stressful. Parents begin researching schools, they start hearing other families talk about testing, and very quickly it can start to feel like there is one correct answer they're supposed to figure out. Almost like choosing the wrong test could somehow hurt their child's chances. But what often surprises families is that admissions committees do not treat the ISEE and the SSAT as competing exams. Both tests are widely accepted. Both are familiar to admissions offices. And both are simply tools schools use to better understand a student's academic readiness. So the real goal isn't identifying a better test. The goal is identifying which test makes the most sense for your particular child. And interestingly, the reason many families feel confused about this decision is they often start the decision process in the wrong place. They begin by asking which test is harder, which test do most students take, which test do top schools prefer. But those questions don't actually lead to the clearest decision, because the right testing choice usually depends on something much more specific. It depends on the child. And in today's video, I want to show you a framework that can make this decision much clearer. Welcome to Admissions Insights. I'm Crystal Stone. Each week, I share reflections and patterns I'm seeing from families navigating private school admissions so you can approach the process with more clarity, confidence, and calm. Because when families are trying to figure all of this out on their own, the process can feel confusing very quickly. My goal is to help parents see the bigger picture much more clearly. So let's come back to that question many families are asking. Should my child take the ISEE or the SSAT? What I'd like to do today is walk you through 4 factors that admissions professionals and experienced advisors often consider when helping families think through this decision. And once you understand these 4 factors, you'll be able to approach the testing decision much more strategically. Let's imagine that we're helping a family decide which test might make the most sense for their child. Instead of starting with which test is better, we start with 4 questions. We look at school requirements, test-taking style, vocabulary versus reasoning, and testing timeline. These 4 factors usually give families much clearer guidance than simply trying to guess which test might be easier. So let's walk through each one. The very first factor is actually the simplest. And it's the one many families overlook when they start researching testing. And that is simply, which test do the schools on your list actually accept? Most private schools accept either the ISEE or the SSAT. But occasionally a school may have a preference or may only accept one of the exams. So before families spend a lot of time trying to decide which test to prepare for, it's always wise to take a quick look at the testing policies of the schools you're considering. Sometimes that alone can narrow the decision. For example, if every school on your list accepts both tests, then families have flexibility. But if one of your schools only accepts the ISEE, that may influence the decision. The important thing to remember here is that your testing should support your school application strategy, not the other way around. And this is where many families accidentally reverse the order. They start by choosing a test and then later discover their school list would have made that decision much easier. I talk a little bit more about how testing fits into the admissions process in my workshop, The Private School Admissions Roadmap. It's a recorded 35-minute session where I walk families through how testing, school selection, and admission strategy all fit together. If you'd like to watch it, I'll link it in the description below. Now, once families understand which tests their schools accept, the next factor often becomes much more interesting because this one has less to do with schools and more to do with the student's testing style. And this is where the ISEE and SSAT may begin to feel a little bit different for many students. This second factor is really about understanding how a student interacts with testing situations. Some students feel very comfortable moving quickly through multiple choice questions. Other students prefer a little more time to think through each problem. Some students are confident test takers. Others may feel pressure when they know that guessing incorrectly might affect their score. Those differences don't mean a student is more or less capable academically. They simply reflect how students experience standardized testing environments. One of the most commonly discussed differences between the 2 exams involves guessing strategy. On the SSAT, students lose a small fraction of a point for incorrect answers. On the ISEE, students do not lose points for incorrect answers. Now in practice, this doesn't mean that students should randomly guess their way through the exam. but it does change how some students approach unanswered questions. For example, students taking the ISEE may feel more comfortable making an educated guess if they're unsure about an answer. On the SSAT, students are often encouraged to skip questions they truly don't understand. Again, this doesn't make one test better than the other, but for some students, the presence or absence of a guessing penalty can influence how relaxed they feel during the exam. Another difference families sometimes notice involves the pacing of the test sections. Both exams include timed sections that measure reading, reasoning, and quantitative skills, but the pacing can feel slightly different depending on the exam level and the section structure. Some students thrive when they can move quickly through questions. Others prefer slightly longer windows to work through the problems. The key here isn't memorizing every structural detail of the tests. It's recognizing that test design can affect a student's testing comfort level. And when students feel comfortable with the structure of a test, they are often able to demonstrate their knowledge more effectively. Another subtle difference between the two exams involves overall testing experience. Students taking the ISEE often encounter sections where they must move fairly quickly from one question to the next. Students taking the SSAT sometimes experience sections that feel slightly more methodical in pacing. Again, these differences are not dramatic. Both tests are well-designed assessments used by hundreds of schools across the country, but for some students, one format may simply feel more intuitive than the other. And that's why experienced advisors often recommend that families look beyond the question which test is harder, because difficulty is rarely the most helpful lens. Instead, the more helpful question is which testing environment allows this student to demonstrate their strengths most comfortably. This is also a good moment to reassure families of something that can reduce a lot of unnecessary stress. Admissions officers are extremely familiar with both exams. They read applications from students who've taken the ISEE. They read applications from students who've taken the SSAT, and they interpret those scores within the context of the student's broader academic record. So families do not need to feel pressure to identify a perfect testing decision. The goal is simply to choose a testing path that allows the student to prepare thoughtfully and approach the exam with confidence. Now that we've considered school requirements and test-taking style, the next factor becomes even more interesting because this one relates to something very specific in how students think and process information, and that is the difference between vocabulary-heavy testing and reason-based testing. Some students naturally excel at recognizing patterns and solving reasoning problems. Other students tend to have particularly strong vocabulary development and reading comprehension. And because the ISEE and SSAT measure these areas in slightly different ways, this factor can sometimes influence which test feels more natural for a particular student. So next, we're going to look at how vocabulary and reasoning strengths can play a role in the testing decision. Many students who read widely develop a very strong sense of language. They recognize word meanings quickly. They're comfortable identifying synonyms. They may even enjoy working with complex vocabulary. Students who have this type of language strength sometimes feel very comfortable with sections of the ISEE, which include vocabulary-heavy question types such as synonyms and sentence completion. These question formats reward students who have built a broad vocabulary over time. For students who love reading, this type of section can sometimes feel surprisingly intuitive. But of course, not every student experiences vocabulary questions that way. Other students tend to shine in a slightly different way. Instead of relying heavily on vocabulary knowledge, they excel at pattern recognition and reasoning. They enjoy solving puzzles. They feel comfortable breaking down unfamiliar problems. They often approach questions by thinking through the logic step by step. Students with this style of thinking sometimes feel very comfortable with the reason-based sections that appear on exams like the SSAT. These sections ask students to analyze relationships between ideas and identify patterns in language. For students who enjoy analytical thinking, those types of questions can feel engaging rather than intimidating. Now, it's important to emphasize something here. This doesn't mean that students are either vocabulary students or reasoning students. Most students demonstrate a blend of both abilities, and both exams measure a wide range of academic skills. But sometimes families notice that their child consistently performs more comfortably in one type of question environment, and that observation can sometimes help guide the testing decision. A helpful way to think about this is to imagine two students preparing for the test. One is an avid reader. They move through vocabulary questions quickly, but they sometimes feel a little slower working through complex logic problems. Another student might be the opposite. They enjoy problem solving and reasoning questions, but they occasionally find vocabulary sections more challenging. Both students may be strong academically, but the test environment that allows each student to demonstrate their strengths might feel slightly different. And that's why experienced educators often encourage families to consider how a student typically interacts with different types of academic questions. It's also helpful for families to remember that both exams are designed to give schools useful academic insight. Admissions committees are not looking for perfection on these tests. They're looking for information that helps them understand how a student approaches reading, reasoning, and quantitative thinking. So while it can be helpful to choose the exam that feels most comfortable for a student, the testing decision itself rarely determines the entire admissions outcome. Instead, it becomes one piece of a much larger picture that includes grades, teacher recommendations, student interests, character, and the overall fit between the student and the school. Some families find it helpful to ask themselves a very simple question when thinking about this factor. When your child encounters a challenging academic question, which response feels more natural? Do they enjoy exploring word relationships and language patterns? Or do they light up when they're solving logic problems and analytical puzzles? That observation alone doesn't determine the testing decision, but it can provide an interesting clue about which exam structure might feel more comfortable. Now, there's one final factor that often plays a very important role in this decision: testing timeline. And interestingly, this factor becomes the most practical consideration of all, because families often discover that testing decisions are influenced not just by student strengths, but also by when the student plans to apply to private schools. Testing dates, preparation time, and application deadlines can all influence how families approach the testing process. So in the final section of this video, we're going to talk about how testing timelines affect the ISEE and SSAT decision, and how families can build a testing plan that feels calm and manageable. One of the things many families don't realize when they first begin exploring private school admissions is that testing is rarely a single event. Students often take these exams more than once. Sometimes the first test provides useful feedback. Students see the structure of the exam, they become more comfortable with the pacing, and then they may take the test again after additional preparation. Because of this, the testing decision is not always about choosing a single perfect exam. Sometimes the decision is about creating a testing plan that allows the student to approach the process with confidence. Let's imagine a student who plans to apply to private schools next fall. If the family begins exploring testing early in the year, they may have time to schedule an initial exam in May, review the results, and decide whether they want to continue with the same test or explore the other option. In that situation, families sometimes discover that the testing process becomes less stressful than they originally expected, because students gain experience with the exam format. They understand the pacing, and preparation becomes more targeted over time. But if families begin the testing process much closer to application deadlines, say in September, the decision may feel more compressed. In those cases, families often choose the test that best aligns with the student's strengths and the school's requirements. Another question parents sometimes ask is it ever okay for the students to take both the ISEE and SSAT? And the answer to that is occasionally families do explore both exams. Sometimes a student takes one test first and then decides to try the other exam to see which format feels more comfortable. In other cases, families simply want to keep their options open if their school list includes institutions that accept different exams. However, in many situations, families find that choosing one exam and preparing thoughtfully is the most straightforward path. Again, the goal is not to create unnecessary complexity. The goal is to choose a testing plan that allows the student to prepare steadily and approach the exam with confidence. You can do this by allowing your child to take a practice SSAT and a practice ISEE and see which one feels best to them. At this point, it's also helpful to step back and remember something important. The ISEE and SSAT are tools used by admissions committees to understand academic readiness. They are not designed to determine a student's entire future. Admissions officers review testing alongside many other pieces of information. They look at the student's academic record, they read teacher recommendations, they learn about the student's interests, character, and potential contributions to the school community. Testing provides helpful context, but it is only one piece of the overall admissions picture. And once families understand the bigger framework, the testing decision feels much more manageable. So if you're currently trying to decide whether your child should take the ISEE or SSAT, here's the framework we discussed today. Start with these 4 questions. Which tests do the schools on your list accept? How does your child typically respond to standardized tests? Does your child feel more comfortable with vocabulary-heavy questions or reasoning-based problems? And what testing timeline makes sense for your family's admission plan? When families walk through these 4 factors, the decision often becomes much clearer. Instead of trying to guess which test is better, they begin choosing the option that fits their child, schools, and timeline. Before we finish, I want to share one resource that many families find helpful when they're navigating the admissions process. If you'd like a clearer understanding of how testing, school selection, and admission strategy all fit together, I've created a short parent workshop called Private School Admissions Roadmap. In the workshop, I walk through how admissions committees evaluate applications and how families can approach the admissions process with more clarity. It's about 35 minutes long, and you can watch it instantly for free using the link in the description below. Many parents find it helpful because it brings together the different pieces of the admissions process in one place. If you're a parent navigating private school admissions and would like clear guidance each week, I'd invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future admissions insights. Each week, we talk about testing strategies, school selection, admissions timelines, and how families can approach the private school process with more clarity and confidence. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next Admissions Insight.